So hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Linda Peters, and I'm the host of AGX Talks. Today, we have another exciting guest for you. We're here with Larry Joseph of Yum Brands. Larry, really good to have you with us.
Glad to be here. Thank you, Linda.
Yeah, so for our audience today, we want to talk about a few different things. We want to get to know you a little bit. So maybe we could start with some background. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, Larry? Maybe where you went to school, where you're from?
Yeah, absolutely. So my background is in geography, and my story actually goes back to before I was even born because my mom survived two plane crashes in the 1970s. And growing up, we always liked to travel, but we didn't travel by plane because that was still a little close to those experiences.
Yeah.
And so I'm the youngest of three children. I have two older sisters. And so since we were doing all these car trips, I was always in the middle of the back seat and really like to pay attention to where we were going. And I was never one to sleep in a car, and I can't sleep in a car to this day or sleep on an airplane. I'm just too curious. And so I knew I really liked geography, but in particular business geography, because I liked seeing all these familiar businesses in different towns we would visit. And how did that McDonald's end up there? Or how did that Kmart end up in the particular location? And I knew that there was a person involved in helping to make that decision along with an organization. So I asked an elementary school teacher, if I want to do this for a career, what do I go to school for? And she said, hey, check out geography. And so I always had that in my mind that that's what I was going to go to school for. And so I went to Kent State University in Ohio, and I did a bachelor's in geography, and then I did a master's in geography with a specialization in business geography and GIS at Kent State, and then went to Arizona State and did a PhD in retail business geography from Arizona State.
Nice, nice. So you really took those questions to heart as a young boy and carried that forward. That's really neat. Um,
Yeah, absolutely.
I want to ask you a little bit about what you do now, because I understand you work at Yum Brands, and I'm sure everybody's really interested in that. Yum Brands as a company is so well known. Can you talk to us a little bit about what you do day to day?
Yeah, absolutely. So I joined KFC, which is part of Yum Brands. Yum Brands, the parent company of KFC, Taco Bell, the Habit Burger Grill, and Pizza Hut. And so I joined KFC in 2016 to, at that time, start up the market planning team. Because even though KFC being a legacy business that dates back several decades, the reason they did not have a market planning team is because they were not growing at that time and really were not growing since 2004. And so being controlled by Yum made a lot of the decisions for the brands at the top. But what they did was they then siloed out the brands and then charted a course in KFC's case, a turnaround story of, okay, how are we going to not only revive this brand, but get it growing again. And so as part of that, it was important to have a market planning team in place to advise on location intelligence for the business and to work with franchisees. So I started up that team in 2016, and I did that for a few years. And then there was an opportunity to make a move to a field-based position to actually work with the franchisees on their growth and help them with finding locations. And then if they needed assistance with working with a broker and really supporting the projects up until the grand opening. So everything that was involved in the development process, whether it be architecture and design and getting them set up with the right contacts, or from the construction side of it and working with cities. And then I was promoted. So I was covering the Western United States, and then I was promoted to senior manager and given oversight over the Central United States, Western United States, and most recently our non-traditional development, which is areas where you have more captive audiences. So things like travel and convenience, or arenas and universities and those type of of outlets. So I still have oversight then over the West with the other two territories and non-trad. And it's all about then bridging the gap between what the market plan says and then how you actually execute that and bring it into fruition with opening up a store. So very much a part of the job is the influencing side. Since we're not building these things ourselves with corporate capital, we're really partnering with franchisees. So since they're taking the risk, it's important to be able to influence, and certainly knowing the market plan and knowing where a KFC can be successful is a huge component to being able to influence a good decision.
Sure, sure. It sounds like you're really a trusted advisor, if you will, for those franchisees because of your expertise and the knowledge that you bring to it.
And that's what it really evolves into over time, because it's about relationships. And so it's one thing to have great data and to have a great plan, but if you don't have the credibility with the franchisee community, then they might see you as just somebody that's pushing growth on them from corporate. But if you actually get to know people and you explain how the market plan works and why we see particular areas that are ripe for opportunity, but then also to understand their needs too, because you might have that optimal point on a map, but real estate costs there just might be prohibitive in order to actually develop in that area. So subsequently, it's about trying to merge what really the optimal plan is versus what the reality is for somebody's capital budgets, and then trying to marriage that together so that ultimately, like I said, we make good decisions.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. Well, it certainly sounds like a great company to work for and lots of opportunity and growth potential, for you as an individual, but also growth potential for the company. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about how your background in geography has really helped you in your role there.
Yeah, absolutely. I think just spatial thinking in general just starts you, it puts you on a path to understand, okay, if we make a decision at one particular location, it's not in isolation. In fact, it's interconnected to all other decisions that had previously been made and that we'll make in the future too. So being able to understand that you're not just looking at particular cross streets and how busy an intersection is, but you're thinking a little bit more broadly of how does this chess piece work into the fabric of how we want to build out a network. And so I think having that geographic background has put me in a unique position to start thinking 2-3 steps ahead when talking with franchisees. And I really owe that to my background in geography. And then just also knowing how to look at things from a macro level and then a micro level, which is also part and parcel to the first part of my answer, but just knowing that you have to evaluate locations at different levels because there's different implications, macro versus micro, on the decision making.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting. And even geography is starting to play a role indoors too. As we think about indoor space, you're thinking about outdoor space. I think there's a lot of potential, for new areas there too. I wonder, there was another thing you mentioned, which I was curious about, because you talked about the communication skills that you really rely on, right, to build those relationships. So, if I was a student graduating and I wanted to get into a similar role that you're in now, what are the sort of skills that I would need to bring?
Yeah, well, certainly when talking with franchisees, having plain language ability is really important. And so understanding the audiences, at some point, it's good to be very technical, and other points, you got to take the technical and turn it into something very simple. So take something like trade area delineation. So that is not a well-known concept to a lot of individuals that don't have a geography background. And there might not be an understanding of, wait a second, how can a trade area extend 1 mile in one direction and 6 miles in the other direction? But being able to explain that in a simple way of, well, you have the central business district here and you have more traffic starting the day. And so they're going into the town. And then as they're leaving the town, it's more convenient. But since there's no other interceding opportunities, that might be their last stop to get fast food and before they're heading home. And so just trying to make complex topics into something that then is easy to explain. But then also, then if you're dealing with professionals, let's say in commercial real estate, it's important to understand the basics of commercial real estate to get into this kind of profession, knowing what LOIs are, understanding the development of leases and purchase agreements, and just being able to speak the lingo a little bit. And there's a lot of growth opportunities to gain that knowledge through, say, the ICSC, for example.
Mm. Yeah, I'm sure it's got to be a competitive space too. There's so many different players in the market, and fast casual and all the different formats. So bringing that knowledge to bear again for the franchisees really puts you in a strong position, I'm sure. Are there other sort of soft skills or things that maybe you learned outside of university that you bring to bear in your job?
Yeah, I mean, definitely call it a skill, but having intellectual curiosity or wanting to put a hypothesis to test is really important. The one thing I did gain from that ASU was really big into was field research, and maintained still an important part of the overall PhD process, that you had to do a field exam. And the obviously desktop analysis is huge, and it sets you up to be able to have the fundamentals in place to understand the data and know what you're talking about. But it's also important, because it is an art and science, to be able to understand how the markets actually function. And you learn a lot from actually going out and spending time in markets and observing and watching customers and watching competitors and just learning patterns, and then going back and testing, okay, are what we seeing on the spreadsheets matching what we're actually seeing in person? Because sometimes you learn a lot, or you may learn something and say, oh, wait a second, let's go ahead and test a hypothesis that maybe we weren't thinking about, but we saw some things on the ground. I'll give you an example right now. As we're seeing inflationary pressures, are then we seeing more impact on lower income customers. And so that's something that's really interesting, to go out and go to some of the lower income restaurants and see and talk to the managers, and how are those restaurants faring versus some of the higher income ones, and are we seeing some trade down in product, or maybe not as much bundling, and then just what are we seeing on the ground, and talking to people. So it's not just about observing, but it's actually getting out and talking to people as well that are key stakeholders.
Yeah, that's great advice. You can't learn it all from just sitting behind a desktop and looking at a computer screen. You got to get out there and in person, and walk around, look at the parking lot, see how many cars are there, time of day, all those good things, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I really appreciate you sharing your advice here today. I think it's really interesting, the sort of skills that you're talking about that students would need to be in the role that you're in today. So I really appreciate you sharing your ideas with us here. With that, I'm going to wrap up this session of AGX Talks and say thanks to our listeners, and ask you to be sure to join us again. We've got some other great speakers lined up, including the U.S. Census Bureau. So Larry, again, thank you so much.
Thank you, Linda.
All right. Take care, everyone.